Okay, folks, it's just turned 3:50. This is HTTP. If you're not here for HTTP, you don't have to go home, but you probably shouldn't stay here. If someone coming in or going out could close the doors back there, that would be immensely helpful. Ian Sweat, thank you. Or Ecker, yeah. I'll get you your stickers. Thank you very much. Oh, lovely. Very nice. And if we could keep the doors closed, that'd be even better. Okay. All right. So this is the HTTP working group. Oops. We, for those who didn't catch it, we had we now have a logo for the work that we do here. We also have some badges, some stickers to hand out, if folks are interested.
There's a couple on the blue sheet.
There's a couple. Oh, there's a couple on the blue sheet. We have more in the background. We'll be handing those out afterwards if folks are interested. If you're having a side conversation, it'd probably be better to do that out in the hallway. If you're having a side conversation, it'd probably be better. Thank you. So, and by the way, these logos are open. The source is freely available on the GitHub repo. So, this is the note well. Hopefully, you're familiar with this. If you're not, these are the terms under which we participate in the IETF. This is important not only for things like intellectual property and copyright, but also things like the anti-harassment procedures, the code of conduct, how we treat each other, which we do take seriously. If you have any issues around this or any questions, you're more than welcome to talk to Tommy or myself. We also have other folks in the IETF who are designated to help out with these issues, so please do inquire if you have any questions. And you can always find this by going to your favorite web search engine and searching for IETF Notewell. So blue sheets are circulating. Please fill those out when they come around. Scribes. Do we have any volunteers for scribes in the room? Lucas Pardue is even standing up to signify that he's going to. No. Okay. He submarined. Do we have any volunteers to scribe this session? Ah, thank you very much. Anyone willing to help out? So if you could either do that on the Etherpad that's in the minutes or on a Google Doc and share it with folks in the room. That'd be great, thank you. Agenda bashing. So we have 2 sessions this week. Today, we're going to take a brief couple administrative items to go over. We're going to have hopefully a pretty significant discussion of a proposal for priorities in HTTP2 with the idea that that would also be useful for the HTTP3 effort. Hopefully we can come to some sort of sense of the room for that. Then we're going to spend a good amount of time on the core specs, as we've done for a number of meetings. We're going to go over some of the issues that the editors would like some feedback on. And then finally, we have 10 minutes reserved for discussion of a proposal for rate limiting headers. And that's a remote presentation. Then on Thursday, we'll talk about the extension draft for most of the meeting. And then we have a discussion of compression dictionaries, a proposal for a new draft there. Did that signify something, or is it just a, okay. Any agenda bashing? No bashing of the agenda. Okay. So let's go ahead. So first of all, a few related meetings since we're early in the week that folks might be interested in. Sorry? That would be lovely, thank you. Unless someone closer to the doors would like to close the doors, that'd be great. Thank you. As you might know, the Quick Working Group is working on HTTP3. Once they finish that, they're going to hand it off to us for maintenance and further development. But that's on Tuesday and Thursday. Sec Dispatch, there is a proposal being discussed, or something that's been actually on our radar for quite some time, being discussed around HTTP request signing. That was mentioned in Dispatch this morning, but the meaty discussion of that's going to happen on Sec Dispatch on Tuesday. There's also discussion of securing proxy to backend communications. Why do those doors stay open? Wow. Okay. Martin? Well, that's not great either, really, is it? Okay.
It was turned off. Martin Thompson. Just a question. Why is the request signing stuff not happening here? Is it?
That's a great question, and I brought that up. Certainly, like I said, it's been on our radar. It's been on our list of drafts we're tracking. The proponents, for whatever reason, took it to dispatch, and then they had a discussion with sec dispatch. That doesn't mean it's not happening here. It just means that the initial discussion happens to be happening over there. Okay. We equally could have had the initial discussion, I think.
Yeah, I was just wondering why, because we have had that discussion here. I think.
I know, and I want to make sure that's one of the reasons we have this slide, is to make sure folks here understand that going to sec dispatch this time around is probably a good idea. So, to my mind, there are three communities involved in that discussion. There's HTTP implementers and the HTTP folks in this room. There's the people who actually want to use it for their applications, and then there's the security community at the IETF as well. And so we need input from all three.
Mike Bishop, I'll add one more to this list, that DNSOP has adopted the HTTPS service draft. So please plan to come to that.
Thank you. Thank you for the reminder. There's also WebTrans.
The first session, because the second one conflicts with the other HTTPS session.
Okay. Actually, if you could send a reminder to the list, that'd be ideal. WebTrans is on Wednesday, and that's discussing something that kind of looks like WebSockets over quick in HTTP3. I know that a lot of folks in the room are interested in WebSockets. WPAC is also on Wednesday. That's web packaging, which has been discussed a little bit here from time to time. And finally, MOPS is a new working group on Thursday morning, and that's about media operations, and that means video, and these days video often means HTTP. So I encourage people to pop into that and see what it looks like. Any other related meetings that people want to note for HTTP folks? Okay, so one more administrative item. Some of you may have noticed that there are only two of us up here at the table. Patrick McManus has achieved escape velocity and no longer is chairing the HTTP working group, so we congratulate him on that. And thank him for his service. Take that however you like. And to denote our appreciation of his service, we've gotten a small gift that we hope he'll enjoy. Patrick, you want to come on up? Or yes, we'll meet you halfway. So this is apparently a glass, and the only glass that is specifically designed for drinking Irish whiskey. Yes. We hope so. We hope so. Gifts can be donations to, no. Okay, so that leaves us, let's just get that off the screen. That leaves us with our discussion of the priorities proposal. So just to catch folks up, there was a discussion starting in the quick working group about the design of the priorities mechanism. They then came to us, the HTTP working group, and some of us wearing different hats, and said, do we really, the charter of Quick says that HTTP3 will have everything that HTTP2 has in it. Do we really mean that for priorities? And we came to an agreement between the working groups that no, we're not going to force your hand on that. You can ship HTTP3 without compatible HTTP2 priorities. And so the immediate discussion afterwards was, well, what would a replacement mechanism for signaling priorities from the client to the server look like? We formed a design team, and these folks are now reporting back to us with what their recommendation is.
Yes, thanks. I'm Ian Sweat. This is Robin Marks. Robin has some nice simulation slides towards the beginning. I'm going to have him talk through, but next slide. So these are the design team goals, at least that I wrote down when I emailed folks on the design team. I don't actually know that these are exactly the correct goals, but I summarized these from the chairs at the time. Hopefully I synthesized them sufficiently correctly. And so I just kind of pulled this up from my email the other day, but determine a solution for HTTP3 to have some client-to-server mechanism, priority hinting mechanism that it can ship with. So other things that we can work on, a mechanism for H2 priorities, obviously, a mechanism to indicate what type of priority hinting is being used. So for example, a negotiation mechanism, something that is non-minimal, so it has to have this feature set that we think we need. And of course, we want to be able to backport it to H2. And ideally, we want to not ship something that we kind of are not sure of. We don't want something that's unproven and introduces too much risk. We don't want to do kind of what we did with H2 all over again. Next slide.
Yeah, so
Why do we need something new? It's basically because HTTP2's approach is a bit too flexible for its own good. So you can build this whole complex dependency tree that you see on the top right side. And depending on the shape of the tree, the bandwidth gets distributed. If you have a flexible system, nobody is going to agree on how to actually use it. You can see that very nicely in how the browsers have decided to implement this. They do it quite differently. Only Firefox is actually using the full complexity of the system, at least within the browsers. There's another point, is that all browsers just use one scheme for all the web pages. So it's one size fits all. This is going to work really well for some pages, but really badly for others as well. Next slide. So given this flexibility and these different approaches, we were interested in which actually works best in practice. Next slide. So these are results from a paper from 2 years ago on HTTP2. We found priorities mainly impact larger pages. In our use case, that was over 1 megabyte. We found that Chrome's approach is actually quite good. This is the black line on the slide. Chrome does everything sequentially. So it downloads a resource in full before going to the next one in most cases. So that's quite good for the web browsing use case. The opposite end, the fair round robin, where you interleave bandwidth between everything fairly, is the worst case. This is kind of ironic because that's also the default in HTTP2. So for example, the old Edge browser did not specify priorities and always fell back to the default, always getting the worst case. We also found some other implementation bugs related to the complexity of the HTTP2 system in that. So next slide, please. So now for Quick and HTTP3, there were a lot of people that said maybe we can simplify this. And there were several proposals proposed on how to do that. But there was a question from the Quick working group, is how well are these proposals going to function in practice before we decide to adopt them. So we decided to revisit that. These are results from earlier this year. We implemented all of this again, but this time on H3 and Quick. We did all the browser schemes and then also the new proposals down towards the bottom. And you can see in this visualization, it's a simple concept, but it can get quite complex and all the flexibility and variance that you get in this kind of a system. So the results from that are on the next slide. We again confirmed round robin is absolute worst, so we took that as a baseline here. So all the numbers here are actually the multiplicative improvement on round robin that you can get. We see on the left that Chrome is the best performing if you look at the whole web page, so all the resources. But then if you look at subsections, what we've called here the above the fold resources, or more aptly actually the critical resources, the things that you really need to load to get a first page view, for example, like that, you can actually do better than Chrome with even simpler schemes, the ones towards the bottom. Another important result was that if you that server-side reprioritization is very powerful. So again, if you have the same scheme for all pages, some pages are going to have misprioritized resources. It's very useful if you, on the server side, can say this resource is actually more important than the browser thinks it is. The problem with H2 is if you have all these different trees, it's difficult to know how to adjust the priority in that tree for each browser. You can do some kind of user agent sniffing, but that's hacky at best. In practice, what companies as Cloudflare have been doing is simply ignoring what the browser tells them and overriding everything on the server side, which kind of annuls the whole user prioritization system. So the new thing we need to come up with really needs to support server-side reprioritization. The final thing is that, again, we can go to a very simple scheme. Some people have been floating simple FIFO and call it quits. But I still think we need a lot of flexibility there. Again, you will have some websites that really function quite badly on a very simple scheme. And then there's also the issue from head-of-line blocking removal and Quick. So if you do everything fully sequentially, you will always still have just one stream on the wire, and then the head-of-line blocking isn't going to do any benefits. So you get a really weird situation where for lossy networks, round robin actually becomes better than FIFO, which is the opposite of what you get on normal networks, or better networks. So you need some flexibility in the system to adapt to those use cases. Those are the main results. And Ian and his team then did some actual tests in the wild recently to confirm or deny this, and he's going to propose them that.
Thanks, Robin. All right, next slide. Yes, so we've been, ever since this design team started, one of the first things I started doing was asking other people to write code, because really I don't write that much code anymore. It's sad, but true. And I convinced a coworker to both fix our existing H2 scheme on our server side. It turns out it had a variety of bugs which caused it to not actually perform as intended for Chrome. Oops. Implement FIFO and LIFO. Actually, it turned out LIFO was already implemented. Don't ask why, it just was. Yeah. It's just pre-existing condition, that sort of thing. We also added round robin. We did not have support for that. But since people wanted to understand like exactly what the H2 default looked like in real-world pages, we wanted to get some data on that. And to go back, GQuick currently uses Speedy. It always has. It never bothered to move over to H2 priorities because it never really was worth the hassle. And Speedy seemed to perform fine. So that's kind of the default in most of these tests, although a few of them you'll see we actually compare as the baseline versus H2 and the baseline versus Speedy separately, just to kind of give you better statistics on the metrics. Oh yes, and FIFO is lowest stream ID first, not the first request that is received. So it's request order, not receipt order. So in case there's reordering on the request. Next slide. Great. So for YouTube quality of experience, really only one scheme was statistically significantly worse than the default of Speedy, and that was LIFO. And that's not that surprising because when you start getting behind on a video playback, you get more and more behind because the newer requests get put in front of the older requests and nothing ever finishes. The degradation is quite significant. I kind of put a 3% and 2.6% is huge. We wouldn't launch an experiment that made something like 0.3% worse. So this is like not quite catastrophic, but very bad. Like this is completely unacceptably bad. So just to give you an idea, you can really mess this up if you get things really, really sideways. Obviously, LIFO is fairly sideways, but nonetheless, it's worth pointing out. Next slide. Actually, some of the most interesting data comes from the Flywheel data compression proxy in Chrome. One of the reasons it's interesting is there's actually a high degree of request multiplexing, and there are commonly a large number of requests that are simultaneously active on the same connection, which is not always true for all of our use cases. It's only for HTTP, unfortunately. It's not for HTTPS, so that obviously limits the use cases a lot. And the summary of the results essentially are Chrome's use of H2 is better than Speedy, which is better than all the other schemes. And if we go to the next slide, the improvements range from 0.4% to 1.7. So green means H2 is faster. So just as a metric. So basically H2 is faster than every other scheme here, even Speedy, which is it's only slightly faster than, and is statistically significantly faster than 95th percentile for all of these. So that's good because this is Chrome's default scheme. So someone at Chrome got something right, at least relative to the obvious options. I think that's great to hear. And this is actually good enough that we would actually consider switching over our default from the current Speedy approach, the H2 ones, even temporarily as we transition, because it appears that this is pretty good evidence. And it actually turns out that we have some other metrics research and such that kind of back up that this is a slightly better direction to move in than all the other options. But next slide. So if you compare it relative to Speedy as the baseline, which is kind of how I originally set up these experiments, the results are less statistically significant. But as you can see, there's still kind of an indication that H2 is better. These are the same metrics. It's just the statistical analysis was done 2 different ways to make it a little bit more interesting. It'll kind of give you some understanding. Next slide. AMP, or Accelerated Mobile Pages. Everyone loves this, I know. So this actually has slightly different performance properties, as you'll see. And in this case, Speedy, which is round robin within bucket, is better than Chrome H2, FIFO, LIFO, or round robin. And the reason for that, my understanding, is that AMP actually has a lot less kind of dependency, like this resource depends on this resource depends on this resource. It's much more designed to be non-headline blocking and kind of inherently. So there's a much simpler resource dependency tree. Next slide. But even so, yeah, the performance improvement is quite large, at least by our standards. You're getting close to 1% performance improvement versus variety of the other schemes. So one thing that is also worth noting here is many people have suggested just using FIFO is fine. I think this data at least presents that you can do a lot better than FIFO without something overly complex. And so, my intuition is we should try to do something because, this is not really that hard to get better than FIFO. Next slide. So the new design needs to be simpler than H2. It needs to work for both HTTP2 and HTTP3. Ideally, it would allow for expressing both the Chrome H2 scheme and the Speedy schemes in some way, shape, or form. Those are relatively simple schemes that seem plausible for different use cases. Should allow for server-side reprioritization. As Marvin mentioned, the existing H2 trees system makes that quite challenging. And it should not use round robin as the default. So there's a current draft out there called that is under Kazuo's name and is written also by Lucas. And it includes a scheme like this, but I'm also going to go over some updated design details that we hashed out when the design team met on Saturday or Sunday. Mike.
Mike Bishop, I think it might also be worth calling people's attention to when we say the Chrome H2 scheme, that isn't the full tree. It is a linked list ordered first by priority bucket and second by request order.
Yes, it is equivalent to essentially a speedy priorities, but request, not round robin, but instead in request order, stream ID order. That's exactly right. Thanks. Next slide. So this is an update to the draft. An updated version of the draft got sent out a few weeks ago. A lot of the details here are actually extraordinarily similar and are just copy-pasted from the draft because a lot of the concepts are the same. But the one major design detail has kind of changed, which is a move from an end-to-end header to one that's more focused on the two use cases that we think we care about. So let me try to talk through that, and other working group, or sorry, design team members can help me if there's confusion. Next slide. So one of the goals here is to have a somewhat extensible scheme. We want to have a core functionality that's actually useful and we can prove is useful. But if we want to add another feature to this scheme, we don't want to have to ship an entirely new scheme end-to-end, and we want to have a way of expressing this new thing. So the idea here is to use key value pairs. Currently, that's specified using structured headers. There might be other ways to do it, but it seems like a perfectly plausible approach. There's two fields, urgency and progressive. So urgency is a number between -1 and 6 right now, but it's basically 8 urgency levels to indicate these are like the equivalent of the speedy buckets. And progressive is a 0 or 1, basically a Boolean to say either I want this approximately round robin or I want this sequentially in order. And that helps you indicate that a resource is only useful like all or nothing. So there are a lot of resources that just can't be rendered progressively. And hence why it's called progressive. Although other people have said maybe it should be called concurrency and other things. That's another time. Next slide. There's a lot of interest in semantics here. Part of the reason for kind of describing some amount of semantics to associate with these priority levels is to say, okay, if you see a request that's priority 3 or something, that means something, and that means the browser, has some meaning attached to this. And ideally, that would allow different browsers to come closer in how they're using the priorities and avoid the situation we have with HTTP2 priorities, where, as Robin presented, all the browsers are using things totally differently, and you can't really derive any meaning from a given priority level. It's just completely arbitrary. So this ideally will allow servers to effectively prioritize things, because if everything's just, as I said, if it's all relative, then there are a lot of different ways of using the tree. As well as gives people some advice on what these things mean and how to use them. So it's a little bit easier for application developers. Next slide. So we talked a little bit about two key use cases before, but I want to outline them in a little bit more detail. One is the client to server over a multiplexed HTTP connection. So that's HTTP2 or HTTP3. So it's pretty clear that we understand that use case. This is exactly what H2 priorities did. And this is something we have a lot of data for, and I think we know how to ship, and we know what the performance properties of it are. The other one is, I think Roberto described it as within the server, where the server is kind of the entire serving infrastructure. And that's the situation where an origin or an application front end wants to change the priority when it arrives at the proxy, or maybe the proxy does itself when it changes the priority. But somewhere inside the serving infrastructure, you've decided, the client specified that this is the priority, but I think it should be slightly higher than the other images or slightly lower. And so I'm going to adjust it slightly. The whole goal, though, here is, in both cases, we're trying to provide hints to the thing that's scheduling resources to allow it to schedule those resources more effectively, and more effectively, use the amount of bandwidth, or the resource ordering, or in the case of HTTP 1.1, it might even be the available connections, because we have 6 connections available. Next slide. All right. So the proposal here is to actually use headers as an API, because they're the standard, or the universal API for HTTP. Applications could also have a specific API. I know a lot of native applications like Coronet, for example, has a way to expose priorities. But that's a little bit out of scope for the design team. That's kind of per application. However, there are a lot of challenges with headers end-to-end. And it's not really clear that the working group wants to deal with those right now at this moment. And we also need a frame for reprioritization anyway. So the proposed solution is to have the client basically consume the header, convert it into a frame on the wire, and then on the other end, if it needs to, it can convert it back into kind of whatever representation it wants. So this is fairly flexible, but it also allows existing APIs to, sorry. Okay. I'll just keep going. Okay. So there are some open questions here. One is, what type of header should this be? Should this be a pseudo header? And can and should this be exposed to the web API? So this is actually a question I was going to look at Mark Nottingham for. There's some question as to whether this is kind of more in the purview of the W3C, or this is in the purview of the IETF, but it's something worth thinking about. Next slide. So the wire encoding goals. The initial priority frame needs to be delivered prior to the headers frame. So it's key that there is actually an initial priority, and we know what it is. The client should send the first request with the initial priorities. So it shouldn't have to wait for the settings. There's definitely a possibility that it does not have settings when it first sends its first request. And we need to allow reprioritization. Everyone in the working group kind of agreed that that was a critical use case that needed to be allowed. And it was somewhat used today, and that hopefully browsers and other applications would use it more in the future. Next slide. So the new proposed frame, and this is actually taken out of the existing draft, is essentially that it's a stream ID and a priority field, which is a string. It's only sent in the control stream because of HTTP2 extensions. It seems like we have some recent results from greasing that kind of confirm that probably only on stream 0 can we really send this new frame and have it work effectively. It must be sent immediately preceding the corresponding headers to make the parsing machinery a little bit easier. And reprioritization is also in the control stream, so that's pretty straightforward. So there's one awkwardness here, which is this situation where I'm making a request on a request stream, and right before it I have to serialize this new frame. It's unfortunate, but just due to how HTTP2 is specified, we don't think we can get away with doing it any other way. I mean, if other people have especially deployment data that shows otherwise, I'm sure we could decide to change this design. Next slide. H3. So this is a little bit more straightforward. This is fairly, there's an ID to indicate whether it's the push ID or the stream ID, at least when it's not on the request stream. Sorry, when it's on the control stream. When it's on the request stream, obviously that indicates what stream ID it is. And in this case, we actually send the priority frame on the request stream first and then on the control stream later. And I had little brackets around there just to kind of indicate that that's optional. So this, next slide. So let's talk about the proxy to origin case, or the kind of within server case a little bit. The tentative proposal is that a priority header can be sent to the proxy, indicates the priority on the previous hop, so whatever the client indicated the priority was in the frame, and it can also be sent as a response to say, actually, I would like to override the priority that the client originally specified. We have an example deployment that's written up by Cloudflare. There's also issue number 57, where Mike and others kind of discuss how this might work and the properties of it. Next slide. Negotiation with settings. This is also in the draft currently. So the key use cases we definitely want to capture are the client saying, I do not support HTTP2 priorities. So if, don't use the default ordering, don't use round robin, so on and so forth. So that's a critical use case. And that was in a previous draft that Lucas and Brad put out, I think at the last IETF. The other thing we'd like is the server can express what information it wants from the client. So the obvious thing right now, and the two things that are in the draft right now, are H2 tree and urgency, which might be renamed to extensible. And it's basically a way of saying, I would actually like HTTP2 tree style priorities if you can give them to me, or I would actually like this new frame that's defined in an extension. So we're actually kind of doing a somewhat odd negotiation scheme. It turned out that negotiating anything with settings is a little bit awkward because you're not really sure whose settings are going to be received first, and you can't rely on ordering. And so we ended up having an 8-bit value, which indicates the priority scheme, and the server expresses kind of the order of priority schemes it prefers, and the client basically chooses the first one that it supports. There's a few other ways of making this work, but I think something with that shape is probably what we'll end up with. Next slide. Keep going, faster. Okay. Some small issues are still to be decided. Should urgency start at 1? This might be kind of confusing to developers. There's also the question of should the lowest priority actually be the most urgent, or should the highest priority be the most urgent? Again, this is one of those like developer API sort of things. If we actually think we're going to expose this to people, we probably should expose them the easiest surface possible. What are the encoding? Next slide. Roberto is painting a bike shed.
Tommy's coming with so many colors.
Yeah. All right, awesome. I like bike sheds as much as anyone. All right, so if we review the core goals and at least the bullet points, when I went back through, and this is sort of unintentional, it seems like we hit kind of the core goals that were outlined at the beginning and covered the core use cases. And I don't think, I think we are quite confident, at least based on the experimental and simulation data, that the scheme that we're outlining here actually will work and actually will perform well. So, next slide. I think we're done. Okay. Martin.
Yeah. So, clarifying question, comment. Where are you at?
I was waiting for directions, so.
Okay. Go ahead.
If you go back a slide, I'm going to be jumping all over the place here.
Last slide.
Yeah. I think there's only 3 here because backporting and indicating that you're not using H2 priorities kind of imply the same thing, right? Yeah. I thought I'd like this a whole lot more than I did in the end. Unfortunately, I'm having real trouble sort of reconciling this notion that you had, which I quite like, the idea that you're using the API of header fields to express priorities. And then you start talking about frames and the ordering of those frames relative to the requests, and you lost me completely.
So I had some of the same thoughts, and I think I'd like us to focus today on the general approach in terms of the expressiveness of the priorities, knowing that the bits on the wire are probably going to need some iteration.
Sure, but I wanted to go back to the requirements that led to those conclusions more than anything else. And you had a slide there that basically said that you have to have the priorities before the first bits of the headers frame lands on the wire.
Yes, I think it's like 5 slides back.
I'm not convinced that's true, particularly if you accept the fact that a header or an urgency header field, whatever you want to call it, I forget what it was, is the API in which you express that. Because you think about those cases where people are streaming header fields into the stack. You're going to stream in the important stuff, the pseudo header fields, and then a block of the other ones. And those might go out on the wire before you actually have access to the information that allows you to prioritize these things. So do we have any information that supports?
I can tell you exactly why that stipulation is in there, and you can decide whether that's a good why. And the reason why is because if you want to allow server-driven priorities and you're sending it back to an origin application front end or whatever, you need to be able to put that somewhere in the original indication, or don't need to, but it makes it a lot easier if you're able to put it in a header in the original request back to the origin. And if you can't, then you need another piece of metadata that says, like, this is the priority information that was on that request. And so having it before you're forwarding it back just makes the process a lot simpler. So it's less a local scheduling decision and more of a, if you want to inform the back end of what the client said, it makes life a lot easier. And that's why that was, I don't know, maybe Kazuo, do you want to add?
I'm not sure I'm finding that particularly convincing, but I'll let others speak.
So Martin, before you go, and for you and everyone else on the line, my understanding of where we're at is that the design team is trying to make a recommendation. The next step for the working group is to decide whether or not it wants to do a call for adoption on the draft, knowing that we're not going to just rubber stamp it. We need to talk about it. Do you think that it's ready for that, or do you think the design team needs more time?
I wanted to work through some of these issues before we talked about that, but I think based on my reading of it before, and that was, I admit, superficial, because when Ian presented it, I realized a number of mismatches between my understanding of what was written down and what was. Oh, it's also changed apparently.
It's changed. This is this is an updated version. Some of the things are taken directly from the draft. Some of the things are notably changed.
But once we've, that's fun. Once we've chased a few of these things to ground, I don't see us doing anything other than what these fine folks have produced, because it's, I think it is approximately the right thing to do. It's right. Just that I want to make sure that what we're taking is reasoned properly. We've got 60 minutes. So
it may be that we adopt something, then immediately spool the design team to work with just some of the worst issues.
Yeah. I think that's the right way to do it.
Yeah.
Mike Bishop, I will note that when you're discussing header versus frame, if you want to allow reprioritization, you have to have a frame. You could also have a header. Okay, Martin says that's not true. Okay, Martin can come back to that. But assuming, with the premise that you have to have a frame anyway, then we started talking about if you want to use a header to set the initial one. Is that end-to-end? Is it hop by hop? Can priorities change hop by hop? And given that H2 and currently H3 no longer have the concept of hop by hop headers, then expressing what you want on this hop versus what the client asked for on the last hop gets kind of dicey if you're using an end-to-end header and trying to mix semantics of different connections in there. So what we wound up with in our discussion yesterday was we use headers anywhere that we are talking about a different hop. And we use the frame to talk about this hop.
Kazuho could just amend what Mike just said. So it's basically the client sending a frame to indicate how that hop should be prioritized, while using a header to communicate that information from the proxy to origin, and from the origin to the proxy to let the origin signal how it should prioritize based on the information that the server has.
Sup, Gentle. I really enjoyed the data that you collected. It seems like you've got 7 different priority levels, if I'm understanding it correctly. You've run it against a bunch of different websites, and there's kind of a couple percentage difference between different approaches. I guess, like, as a website developer, I would want to be like, well, for websites that have these particular characteristics, we use this priority scheme, and these other websites, we use this particular priority scheme. I'm curious if you've got any recommendations on any of that, or if you're planning on doing anything like that.
Actually, I think some of the text in the draft is actually like not a bad recommendation, because it does talk about some of the issues about like whether resources can be loaded progressively and whether they depend on each other and so on and so forth. I don't think that's the end-all be-all, and actually I think some of the post linked by Cloudflare is actually good about that as well. But I think the answer is either as a browser needs to be slightly more intelligent about exactly understanding what the dependency structure it's trying to load is, or the website needs to help the browser and say, like, I think you're misinferring the dependency tree. I know that's a hard answer.
Yeah, I guess I'm imagining, like, if my website has lots and lots of resources, if I should be using priorities to system 6, for example, then if that could be automatic, then that would make the whole thing feel simpler to me. But yeah, anyway, thanks.
Roy Fielding. In your presentation, I didn't see any reference to the messages that I sent earlier about using just a header field. And I feel at this point that while I appreciate a lot of the work that's gone into it, we're really on the cusp of a changing document and not something that's ready for any sort of notion of consensus, even amongst the design group. So I think that the work should continue and find the right path. I'm not really interested in a lot of the complexity that's inherent in the scheme right now, in the sense that you've got a lot of talk about frames and prioritizations and using different things, which, from my perspective, I don't need any of that. I just need a header field. So I would like to get us back to the point where we have discussions in the design group or whatever, or we shift out of the design group. We should actually be thinking about all of the complexity of HTTP, not just Chrome's interests, not just one browser's interest or a different browser's interest. I mean, the idea here is that we have to adapt the rate at which the protocol is processing the requests to all of the different applications that might use HTTP. The one size all doesn't work, and that perspective doesn't work. And so I would prefer that we spend more time introducing flexibility to the priorities as opposed to trying to shift them into the simple repetition of H2's priorities.
Martin Thompson. I find myself agreeing with Roy for other reasons that I think are equally valid. When I asked the question about the ordering of these things, I didn't realize that was masking the bigger issue of how this manages hop by hop or end to end in this whole thing. And in the earlier iterations of the draft proposal that this is evolved from, there was this very simple notion that you would set a header field, and maybe the header field would be changed by intermediaries along the path as they applied their knowledge of what the situation was, and then it would come back with different values again, such that the origin server could have some sort of input into that process. And now we've got this notion that, well, you have that process going on, and at the same time you have something where individual steps in that chain would make statements about the next hop in that chain. That to me sounds like a far more complex situation to be in, and I don't know that that's really all that helpful. Do you have any information to suggest that this is absolutely necessary because it's complexity, and it's the sort of complexity that I thought that we kind of decided we didn't need?
I can give you my thoughts on that, sure. I mean, at the end of the day, I think we kept coming back to the idea that there was a lot of interest in actually having a hop-by-hop header, and that doesn't exist in some sense.
Sure.
So
interest or evidence that this is useful?
Well, I think we
really
have
what I'm trying
evidence
to drive
that
at.
the hop-by-hop feature is useful.
Yep.
So I don't think that's really, is that?
No, we're talking about whether whether the signaling that we have and the extra information that's carried in the signal as input to prioritization decisions that are made at various points in the network is useful for performance. This
Yes.
is a performance enhancement thing.
Yes.
Do you have evidence that the hop-by-hop signal, in addition to an end-to-end style signal, is valuable for performance? I think I saw that there was evidence that.
So we have evidence that the
signal is
hop-by-hop signal is useful, and we have evidence that the kind of origin to proxy signal is useful. We actually have no evidence right now that the end-to-end signal is useful because no one's ever done it.
But we just talked about having an API. The header field was sufficient. Okay, I'm going to sit down.
We're going to close the
So
I think.
I was coming up here to address exactly these things. Hope we'll see if I succeed. This is Roberto, by the way. So one of the observations was that in many, many deployments, it seems that the thing that's terminating a multiplexed connection, whether that be a client for HTTP 1 stuff trying to do multiplexing, or a reverse proxy that is terminating an H2 or an H3 connection, the server the server that is receiving the requests is very often an HTTP 1.1 server, regardless of how the client connection is actually terminated. And so we need a mechanism of specifying to the thing that is terminating the multiplexing how it should do something, right? And if you have an HTTP 1.1 client, it's pretty obvious that the only thing you can do, an HTTP 1.1 server, it's pretty obvious the only thing you can do is put a header in there, unless you're going to do an HTTP 1.2. I don't know. So it seems like that's a pretty foregone conclusion. And the next question you have is, do you strip it or don't you strip it, right? And if you don't strip it, then you have all kinds of additional complexity around caching that gets really interesting and fun. Clearly, we could invent a new category of headers, but then we'd have to deal with the backwards compatibility of current deployments. The thing that was mentioned in the design team there was, hey, you know, even if it does screw with caching a bit, at least it's not a correctness problem. It's going to be an optimality problem. So it is possible to do that, and the system shouldn't fall over and do anything really terrible. On the other end, from sending from the client side, right, the observation was that many implementations are composed of different libraries together, and it was not obvious that there was any one API that you could specify that's going to go all the way to the part of the implementation that actually has to do the multiplexing, which was the reason for saying, you know, ultimately the one thing that is HTTP, gosh darn it, is there's headers and then there's other stuff, right? So headers is the way to talk to the thing that's actually doing the serialization and the multiplexing. I see Roy laughing. Anyway, sadly true. Like HTTP, man. So, you know, if we decide to make that end-to-end, well, I mean, okay, fine. But then you have to do a disambiguation because you are trying to target a specific hop when you are a client trying to do signal this prioritization. So either you have to make rules for stripping or you have to make rules for mutation, right? Anyway, there you go, guys.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, mic line was closed already. Thank you.
Kazuho, firstly, I just wanted to point out that we are mostly discussing about how we convey the signal instead of the semantics that we have. So maybe a path forward would be to talk about, to see if we have a rough consensus on the semantics of, and then maybe talk further about the using headers or frames.
The mic line is closed. Sorry.
Okay, so it's pretty clear that we don't have consensus on the solution, and there's still a lot to discuss. In my mind, the question is, where should the discussion happen and how? I don't.
Yeah.
Just from my perspective, I'm a little concerned that I see things like where, you know, the design team comes to consensus, the design team is closing issues, but it's not incorporating the entire community, and so I'd rather have these things done in public spaces, so we can get the input from the entire community. And so I'm thinking maybe we should hum to say, do we want to adopt this as a starting point, knowing that it's not going to be the end point, or do we want to give the design team more time?
Right. Yeah. And so, I think one question, just if anyone on the design team thinks that having more time as just a design team would be like very important or change the output of this, that would be good to know. But it seems, my impression is that the design team, you know, has what they have, and they think that's a good spot, and it's probably most useful to have that come into the larger group now. So is that, I see nodding, so that seems to be general. Yeah. Okay.
So do we need to hum, or?
Yeah, we can hum.
Well, we're going to do a call for adoption. I think is the next step. Does anybody think that does anybody want to stand up and say that no, we shouldn't do a call for adoption yet? Martin Thompson stands up.
Yeah, Martin Thompson. I think this issue of whether this is a hop by hop or end-to-end signal is kind of fundamental,
Absolutely.
and we need to resolve it. Now, sure, we can say that we're going to adopt something and then decide to do something completely different to what's being proposed in that document. But I don't see why we have to. I think we should probably just resolve the issue before we adopt this thing. Since it proposes something.
Why are you gaining adoption on that?
It's fundamental.
Sure.
So there's also, I mean, I think, as has been already pointed out by Kazuha, like, there are two parts to this. There's what we want to communicate of essentially the 7 levels plus the progressive bit. And if we think, essentially, we could adopt that part and say we're not sure about the communication scheme for it, but we believe that that is the right thing to communicate however it is done.
Yeah, I think that's less contentious. I think I don't care about that side of things as much, nearly as much as I care about the fundamental question of whether this, what it is that we're prioritizing. And if we can't agree on what it is we're prioritizing, I don't know where we're going.
So, and I don't think we know where we're going yet, but if you look at the history of the documents we've adopted and what comes out the other end, there's often a remarkable difference. And you know, the higher bit here is the HTTP working group is working on this now. And I think that's the question at hand.
I had a question for Martin about how, I mean, we've been discussing this particular question on and off for months. I'm not, I don't think, maybe you have some magic way to resolve it quickly, but I think it's hard.
Yes.
No, I'm not debating the fact that the question is a difficult one. I'm just thinking that we're spending our time debating whether to adopt something where we should be spending that time debating the question.
To be clear, we're out of time for this item.
Good.
So that's why we're talking about adoption or not. Yeah. We're talking about next steps. Yeah. So I think we'll do a call for adoption on the list. Before we go to the next item, you know, if we adopt something, we'll have list discussion, we'll have issues. The next opportunity to discuss this face-to-face for this working group is going to be in Vancouver. Is this urgent and topical enough for folks where they'd consider an interim meeting? I see some nods. There's an obvious opportunity for doing that.
So, Martin Thompson, are you suggesting co-location with the quick interim?
Cheers.
Right. That seems far more tractable than any other thing that might be implied by.
Well, we're not going to do it
so
in
come out
Japan the
and
week
say
before.
it.
So
yeah. So come out and say it. Well, I'm going to be at the quick interim. I suspect a large number of the people involved in this discussion will be at the quick interim. So maybe that's not such a bad thing. I do want to make sure that we're not sidelining anyone who might not otherwise be at that meeting. So if anyone is inclined not to go to that meeting anyway, but would be very interested in this topic, I think it's probably a good idea to talk to the chairs.
Well, the really nice part of that is that Julian and Roy are going to be in the area at the time as well.
Right.
So,
Ted Hardy, a clarifying question about your proposal to co-locate that. As a potential host of the quick interim meeting, the person who reserved the rooms, for example, what we have reserved now is currently split up for, essentially speaking, the interop and then a few days of the quick standards meeting. If you are planning to add days to that on the beginning or end, I am not at all confident at this point that we have those rooms available. If you want to replace the interop with a different standards meeting or run them in parallel, that seems very different, and I'm a little concerned.
I was thinking about something else, but I was not assuming any availability on your part. But we can take this offline.
Thank you very much.
Sure, you're off the hook. Yes. All right. We'll have more discussions about this. Thank you very much, and thank you to Ian for the presentation. That was very helpful. I can close that. So now we have HTTP core. Roy, do you want to present this one?
Okay, so Roy Fielding, and editing the HP 1.x documents with Julian and Mark. Next slide. Okay, so everyone probably knows we have the latest version of the drafts for draft 06. These are links to them. Okay, next slide. And there's also 2 sets of diffs out there that you can look at. The first set are just the differences since the last version. And the second set are all of the wording changes that we've made since the RFCs reorganized so that you can just see the word diffs. And that can be very useful. If you're only interested in things that we screwed up, then that's what you want to look at. If you want to see how we've reorganized everything, then you want to look at the whole GitHub history. The vast majority of our work so far has been trying to fit the right paragraphs in the right locations and then making minor changes to the paragraphs after that. So you'll see it's much easier if you're just interested in what the protocol changes are to look at the Franken RFC diffs. Next slide. Since Montreal, we closed the list of issues. I'm not going to go through them, but they're all up there on GitHub. Next slide. And there's 2. We've also been tracking the errata status. Julian has kept detailed track of all the errata posted against the 72 3x RFCs, and we only have 2 left to fix in the drafts. Those issues 163 and 53. And I'm not sure if we can talk about them later or not, but they're there if we can. And next slide. So what are the issues to discuss now, Mark?
Okay. So if you go to the HTTP core issues list and make it bigger, we use the label discuss to look at things that we think need discussion from the working group for each meeting. And we only have a few this time, actually. I think I marked more, but then we resolved a few or moved a few down the road. Sorry. How's that? So first off, number 258, tighten language run delete request bodies. So we had another issue to tighten the language around get request bodies, which was, there are still folks who think because HTTP at the generic framing layer allows any request to have a body, that it's okay to put a request on a get, when in fact that breaks a lot of things. And so we introduced a requirement there to guide people away from that design decision ever so gently. Or a little less gently than last time, I guess, really. We tried to do it last time and we were too subtle. So we were a little less subtle this time.
This is the third edition of being too subtle.
Yes. And at the time, one of the questions that came up was, well, delete isn't pretty much in the same place. Why don't we say the same thing for it? And in reality, there are 2 different approaches we could take here. One is to let delete follow the path of get, which is it was never defined to have a request body. Therefore, interoperability dragons be there, don't put one there. Or it would take the path of options, which is there's a request body that could occur on this, but we don't really know what it means. That's up to the resource or something else to define the semantics of. I think that about covers it, doesn't it? And options, of course, the request body is used more often than lots of other places.
Yeah, maybe you scroll down a little bit.
Yeah, and so Julian opened this. He wanted to consider them separately. So there's some discussion here, and Everett points out, yes, the intent of delete is just to delete the target resource. And so the question is, what would a request body mean, and especially for generic software that didn't understand a particular request body format, what would that do? And would it break any existing uses of delete? And so I think he is proposing we take the get path for delete. Julian, I think not in this one, but later points out that there are people who are using delete bodies.
Is Julian online?
And do you want us to press the magic button, Julian? And 16 hours ago, he gave an example. Aha. Hello.
Hello.
We can hear
Good
you.
morning.
Sure.
So, yes, I think it's more like options. And I've seen lots of people actually putting instructions about how to perform the delete into the payload. And I don't think we ever said that's okay, we just define it. So I really don't see how we can forget something that was known before.
So Roy, you responded here. Do you want to summarize what you said?
Well, I think it's always been forbidden from the sense of semantics. That's, I mean, I realize that you can read it in a way that by not actually demanding that we not send it, that we are allowing it. But it had the same exact text was used as for the method get for the same reason. We just didn't want the parsers to change to not read the body, because if you don't try to read the body, then you're creating a security hole. So we put that language in to be vague in the way it is because we don't want the semantics to be effective, even if you put something in the body. So you're not supposed to do anything in the body, period. Even if you send it, you're not allowed to do anything with it. That's the intent. So I know I'm absolutely certain what the intent is because I lived through that nightmare several times. And I agree that some people have taken the liberty of stretching what's there into whatever their latest application is. But they've always done it in a particularly stupid way. So I don't care if we break those. I just, they obviously look like they're looking to be broken. There's already servers they do not interoperate with. And the point of the protocol is to define what is interoperable, not what everyone does.
And interoperable on the internet, not on little private networks or servers, yeah.
I have to strongly disagree because, I mean, we don't say what the semantics of a post payload is. So what's the difference here?
Well, a post is specifically defined as look in the payload to find out what it is.
Yes.
So, but you can't say that we have some kind of interoperability for post and then claim that putting something into a delete payload is bad, because I think we had an interesting side discussion about whether an intermediary is allowed to drop the payload on a delete request, and I think it would be good to get to the bottom of this first, because I don't think this is true. I mean, that implies that intermediaries can essentially drop any request body except for maybe post, and that is certainly not true. So I think that's something we need to come to a consensus about first, and then get back to the question about whether, I mean, if I have a client and a server and have my API that I implement, and I can be sure that conforming intermediaries will leave my payload body alone, I just don't see why this would be a problem to put something in there. I mean, I don't see any reason for that.
So Julian, the difference is that software that either drops errors on a post payload, a request payload, or software that doesn't make it available to the application would be considered broken, I think, by anyone. But software that either rejects a delete request with a payload or doesn't make it available to the application, I suspect is quite common. And I'm thinking about web application firewalls, I'm thinking about various APIs and various servers and various libraries that implement HTTP on the server side, as well as intermediaries and CDNs and proxies.
So does anyone here have an opinion on this?
We have. I think Roy and I are aligned, and Julian is not.
But I understand Julian's position absolutely. I understand it.
Yeah.
So it's I understand where he's coming from and why he'd want that preference. So others.
Maybe we could fork out another ticket to clarify under which conditions an intermediary can eat a payload and not forward it. Because I'd like to understand why delete is different from, for instance, patch or a new method to be defined. Or is it, maybe it's not different, I don't know.
Well, the only problem is that there's no actual requirement that a gateway forward a request.
But that seems to be a bug in the spec, because that essentially makes it impossible to define new methods, right?
No.
Okay, yeah, so we have some comments in the room.
Martin Thompson, are we talking about preserving the use cases that these people use these bodies for, or are we talking about simply maintaining backward compatibility through some sort of adherence to the spirit of previous specifications? Because I'm inclined to say that, you know, every server I've seen drops delete bodies or doesn't pass them through. And so in terms of interoperability, the request body on delete is pretty damn close to useless.
On
but I do
HTTPS?
Yeah, even there. But it's going to depend on the software you're running. And so I'm kind of okay with what Roy and Mark have proposed on this one. If you want to preserve the use case, then you have header fields.
And I think there's also a question of are these people who are doing these use cases, they're not necessarily going to change because we write something in the core document, and this is more about guiding new implementations or people who are trying to do something in a standard interoperable way, and those clearly are interpreting things in a non-standard way.
Right, so my point is that if we're defining what it means to interoperate, then clearly sending no delete body is the way that you do that. And depending on it being there and remaining there is not necessarily something that would be advisable. Now, of course, people who do these things and will continue to successfully put bodies on delete messages are of course, free to do so. But it won't be following these specifications anymore.
Yep.
I think that's okay.
Be part of the protocol.
Steph Dental, I agree with Julian on this. Oh, sorry, did you want to jump in, Julian?
I think if we make a normative change to the protocol that rules out something that, in my mind, is clearly allowed right now, we need to have a very good reason to do so, and I haven't heard that yet. And if the reason is that intermediaries are actually allowed to drop the body, I think we need a separate issue to clarify that, because I don't think they are. And that also affects the whole extensibility story of HTTP. So if there's any doubt about whether intermediaries are allowed to drop request bodies on methods they don't know, we need to clarify that, and that's much more important than this issue then.
Julian, that's not what's being asserted. It's not that they're dropping bodies on things that they don't know. It's they're dropping or not making available or rejecting bodies on things that they do think they know because they have defined semantics.
Steph Gentle, I feel like there's a dangerous thing if we start disallowing bodies everywhere. I mean, I've written web apps. I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble for some people here. I've put bodies on GET requests, and I love doing so. One of the reasons is that semantically, if what I'm doing is requesting something, I don't want to just push all of my post bodies. I don't want to make every request that contains a body end up saying post on it. I think that means that all of the other HTTP methods become pointless. For what it's worth, I think that it's still worth having bodies on GET requests, on delete requests, and so on, insofar as those requests are matching the semantics that are meant by GET and delete. But my 2 cents.
Okay, but you realize that that's not HTTP anymore. You're not getting any value out of the ecosystem there.
Yeah, the problem that you run into is that there is TCP or SS or TLS connections, and then on top of that is HTTP, and the only thing that differentiates the two are the set of agreements we've made to restrict what we send. So I understand, what I really want is a search method. But I can't define a new method. I'll just send GET instead, and I'll send stuff in the body. There's a reason we didn't allow that in the first place. It's to make the URLs valuable and linkable across the web. That's why it was there. So as much as I appreciate that use case, I deliberately killed it.
Okay.
It's not, and feel free to blame me for that, or Tim Bernsley, or anyone else. Tim actually had separate methods, but
And we have talked about bringing search back. That's
yeah, search is a different method to use. It's not the sense that you have a good reason for it. I know there are other good reasons to not allow it.
Sure, I get it. I don't think it's worth us arguing about it here, but
it's not really an argument.
And I hear you.
And one point I'd like to bring up to that is, if we do, if you did want to specify, like, yes, you can have the body in there, I think we do need a good explanation of how we understand the semantics to make it interoperable. And I think that's the part of the bar that it can't really satisfy, because these are all non-standard use cases.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I guess I just don't want all of my requests to be post requests. Like, if that's the path that we go down for anything that's not generic, anything that's not a regular GET request, then that's what we have. And I think it sounds like that's your vision of what HTTP is.
Not at all. Not at all. Our intent here is to make sure that we define very carefully and very clearly what the semantics of a body and a request are for all the methods we do define. Okay. And that's a case-by-case thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it seems like, it seems like we should kind of wrap this up. We have some disagreement among the editors, but I think it'd be good to get a good sense of the room and what the working group wants to do on this. We've had some comments, but not a ton, so I think it'd be appropriate to take a hum on this. Yes? Okay. So essentially the two options are, do we allow, are you guys going out to be able to hum from? Yeah, very good. Yeah, love it. All right. So there are going to be two different options. First is that we do not allow bodies on delete, or essentially say the client should not send this. We have it essentially conform to the GET format. And then the other option is that we have it conform more to something like options, and you can have a body in there. So if you prefer that delete stays like GET, please hum now.
Wait.
Sorry.
Sorry,
Yeah.
you said stays like GET. That's not true, because we are making a change here. So it's not staying like GET. It would be changed to be like GET.
Right. Yes. Should delete be specified to behave like GET? Okay. So if you would like delete to be specified to behave like GET, please hum now. Okay. And if you would like it to not behave like GET, but to be able to have a body, please hum now. And Julian, I assume you're humming for that, but you have a mic. Okay. So I think within the room here, the consensus seems pretty strong in favor of having it behave like GET, and so I think that's what we'll go ahead with now. And if we're adding that into the GitHub thing. Thank you, everyone.
So just for the record, we had one hum in favor of bodies from the Jabber room.
Yep, great. That's good to know. And we'll confirm that on the list as well.
We don't do the whole. Okay.
Next.
How do I go back now?
Can't see it.
I can't.
Can you see it?
There. What? Okay, I'll just do this. Let's just make the thing. I could go to the control panel, but really I can't be. All right. Next up, our old friend updating stored headers. Sorry? Our old friend updating stored headers. So we've had a fairly long-running discussion here of what to do about updating stored headers in a cache. So when a 304 comes in and it has new headers, the current specification says that you update the stored copy with the new headers. And it turns out that that is not always done consistently by implementations. A few implementations don't do it at all, which is just a bug. But especially the browsers omit some headers from the update. And we've been going through a discussion of why that is and what the right design is. And you can see it's been a fairly long discussion. And I wrote some tests to figure out what people actually did, and we gathered some data on that. And I think This is the most recent proposal. Oh, and there was a comment an hour ago, which is to replace the third paragraph, and of course that's contextual. Thanks, Mark. I think we're talking about this proposal here, where we say something like, due to their semantics, updating some header fields can result in the cache state becoming consistent and invalid, depending on how it is implemented. For example, updating content location might make a cache response incorrect, or updating content range might be unrealistic after partial responses have been combined. Likewise, changing the value of a header field might have external effects that the cache cannot account for. For example, a user agent cache stores a pre-rendered artifact instead of the raw bytes of an HTTP response. Changing the content post facto is not possible and possibly dangerous. And so I think, where'd it go? Nope. Thank you. Thank you. In these limited situations, a cache may omit the headers listed below from updates. Servers should not send updated values for these headers in a 3 or 4 response if the new values are critical to interpret the cached response. Rather, they should generate a full 2xx response. And so I went on to say, I'm only comfortable with this approach if the list is limited and relatively static. I did as much digging as I could through the browser revision histories and discussions, and I think that there was a lot of cargo culting around old 2616 and even 2068 language around cache updates where people misunderstood it and then applied it unevenly. And as a result, a lot of headers are exempted from updates that don't need to be. And in the cases I talked about before, like with content range and content type and things like that, I completely understand why the browsers want to exempt those headers. But there are other headers like everything starting with X content is exempted, which doesn't really make sense, or content dash. And I think that's because they thought that those indicated what entity headers were. Of course, we removed entity headers from BIS. That's not a concept in HTTP anymore. And so it's really just talking about what the right list of headers are to include in this exemption. And so I wanted to flag this for discussion to see if folks are on board with this general approach, and if so, if we can get a little progress on the list of headers to exempt. Set cookie and set cookie 2 are really interesting too, by the way. Martin, you stretching your legs, or? Oh.
No, I was just wanted to talk to Andy first. Martin Thompson. I might be able to help with set cookie. Is it because what's happening is that the cookies are being taken off as the response comes in and acted upon at that point, and then there's no expectation that cookies will be available to cache responses?
Right.
I think this is an artifact of having a deeply integrated stack rather than one that is strictly layered.
Right.
So I don't know that that's strictly a problem. It's just an interesting side effect of the way this works, is that the browser is effectively acting as an intermediary that's stripping off cookies because it's already dealt with them.
Right.
And when things request things from the cache, they don't care about cookies because we know that none of those things care about cookies.
It's taken as a processing instruction almost.
Right, right. And that is fairly consistent with the sort of way that cookie works, in the sense that it applies at the time that it arrives, not sort of any time thereafter. It's not attached to the
I think it
to the resource.
used to, but when you start thinking about things like service worker and some of the more advanced things people are doing with fetch, things change.
I know, and service workers always make me nervous when I start to think about these things. I don't know that there's any good answers here, but that may be the model that we're applying here. That's all.
What I found interesting is that, you know, one could maybe make a safety argument that it's not safe to cache set cookies because, you know, then they get reused. But as you can see, a lot of intermediary caches do cache them, so that doesn't really, you know, hold. Although actually that changed in the last set of tests. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a little weird.
Yeah.
I'd agree with Martin. It's most likely they're causing an alert trigger as they're being processed. You know,
right.
They're probably still in the cached representation. That it's just not, you know.
I don't know if we store that or not, but we probably do. Yeah.
But putting aside the exact headers, the overall approach, is this a reasonable way to go, do you think?
Yeah, you got to deal with the world as you find it.
I know.
This is kind
in
of
a perfect world, we wouldn't do any of this, but yeah.
We'll have a look at our implementation to make sure that this is okay. Obviously, blanket prefixes are not great. we'd rather not have that. But
Sure.
yeah, I'm sure we can fix it.
Okay. So what I might do as a next step then is to put together a PR with a very conservative list, and then we'll, talk about the additions one by one. We'll need to loop in Anna. We'll need to loop in, folks on the browser side. So, all right. Thank you. Where did I go? There we go. Next up. Oh, come on. There we go. Julian. This is issue 163, which is errata ID 5236. I'll open that up. Oh, dear. Oh, come on. There. Right. And so, I think there was a thread which involved Roy on this one. Do you remember this thread, Roy?
No, I completely lost track.
Let's page Roy back in. I think it was you. I could be wrong.
I don't know. Did the discussion end with Roy? Roy? Did I? Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I did just briefly looking at the corrected text. It's not correct. So, in the sense that if you have a validator that's based on content MD5, for example, or a hash of the content, it is going to be the same validator no matter how many different media types you have for that representation. So you may have multiple. You may have the same image, for example, in different media types based upon which particular browser accepts what particular media type, something like that, which actually represent the same number of bits. It's just that one browser called it X experimental image, and the last one, and a more recent one, calls it application image, whatever, just purely because of versioning. So the exact same content, exact same bits, they have the exact same validator, and that's perfectly normal.
Right. Just want to make sure there's nothing else in the thread that...
Martin Thompson, today I learned something. I didn't realize that the validator only applied specifically to the of the body. If that's not clear, can we make it more clear?
Oh, I thought it was clear. No, if I don't know, we certainly put a note in this issue that we should check it to see if it's clear.
Yep.
I mean, last I recall, it was pretty clear, but pretty much all the mistakes are pretty clear to me.
This is the problem. It's in your head, but it may not be in the document.
It may not be in the document at all.
Yeah.
Yes, I know.
I'll check as well. But I think this is a fine resolution to that.
Right.
It may need rewording. It's a little. It wasn't entirely clear to me what it was trying to say. So
this might be helpful too.
Oh, yes, I do remember that one.
I think this is why I said we can close this with no action, I think.
Yeah, I think we can close it.
I think we close it with no action other than maybe the editorial suggestion.
Sure.
I'll take a look.
Take another squeeze at making that clear. Okay. Thank you.
We want a new issue.
Sure. Editorial is fine, yeah. Our old friend 128 quoted cache control directives. So I did some testing again and found that different implementations handled quoting of cache control directives pretty wildly differently. And I suggested that. How's that? Okay. They should give us 2 mics. But then, oh, never mind. But you're not using the mic to tell me to use the mic. And we had a long back and forth about this, and I think, yeah, it's a very long back and forth about this. This is another area where Julie and I don't quite see eye to eye. I think there's a proposal. No, there's not. No, there is. Can we resolve this with must not generate and should accept quoted cache control parameters? Julian?
Well, my question there is that why do we need to change the why is it must not? What is the compelling reason for it? I don't see these applications breaking unquotes.
They don't pay attention to quoted values, which can break people's expectations about caching. And there's a lot of them.
Yeah, we found a bug in Apache too, which was totally cool. I came this close to getting it committed, and then I didn't.
Oh, that's not been committed yet.
No, it hasn't been committed yet. So it's there, it's proposed, it's ready to go. We just need to give it +1s.
Okay. Julian?
I actually would have to swap all the discussion back in. I think this is a bit too complex for discussion right now in the room.
Well, I
don't think we have gotten to the bottom of the problem yet.
I put it up for discussion because it's been open for a long time and we haven't made progress on the issue.
Yeah, that's because you're making a proposal for a normative change, and I don't think you have enough data for that and enough justification. So one way would be not to do it. I think that should be the default in this spec, not to change things if we don't have very broad consensus that something needs to be changed.
Tell me what more data you need. I will collect it.
Well, we had that discussion, I think, with Matt, trying to figure out why their parser actually treats things that way and not the other way, and we didn't get a reply to the actual question. So the underlying question is, if you write a parser conforming to the HTTP spec and do not treat these things correctly as suggested by the spec, why did you do that? And why don't you fix it?
And
That's
I think
my question.
Right. And my position is that for whatever reason, over the last 30 years, almost...
No, wait. Wait. We're talking about the changes that we made 5 years ago.
Sorry?
We are talking about the changes that we made 5 years ago, where we simplified the grammar to allow token and quoted string everywhere. That's different from 2616.
Right. So maybe we made a mistake then.
But 2616 allowed both too. It just did it in a different way, right?
Right.
No, not for cache control.
Right. Well,
it did for extension parameters, but not for the predefined ones.
We failed to communicate. We and our predecessors, although that includes Roy, so failed to communicate well enough to implementers to implement this correctly, and the implementations don't behave well with this kind of input. And as I understand it, especially the client implementations, don't want to change the way they behave regarding this, because to them it's all risk and no reward. They are compatible with the web as it's deployed. Why would they change their code just to align with a specification that was never implemented? And so to me, the most obvious thing to do is to change the specification to match the reality of the internet.
And my proposal remains to look at the individual bits in the source code and try to find out how they manage to correctly pass certain fields and then not to do the remaining 2%. So I'm pretty sure that for any parser that you can show me that treats extension parameters correctly and does not treat the predefined characters as, predefined parameters as defined by the latest HTTP specs, it's either intentional or a bug. And if it's intentional, I'd like to understand why they did that. And if it's a bug, I'd like to fix them, have them fix them. And we're talking about 3 main clients right now, or even only 2, with Edge being gone. 3, sorry.
So can we time bound it somehow so we can get this at least,
that would be good.
You know, the data in there by January, we can decide in February?
Did Matt give us a link to source? Even that would be helpful at this point. Where are we? I don't think he did, no.
I mean, we know what was wrong in Apache, going back to Roy's statement. It was parsing things correctly and then omitting one certain step. So that was an outright bug. And I mean, the bug fix might not be committed, but that's a different story.
Yeah, that fix will definitely be committed at some point, regardless. Because we're actually parsing it twice, 2 different ways, and that's just bad.
Sure. All right. Well, if we can get alignment with, you know, at least a couple of parsers, which, you know, really we're talking about cache implementations here. So browsers and intermediaries and CDNs. So if we can get a few more aligned, that's great. So, but maybe we should just open a few bugs and see if we can make progress in a few months, at least some indication that they would address them. And if not, then we'll revisit the issue. Yeah? Okay. Can you? Oh, thank you. Great. That's the last one we had marked as discussed. Let's take a quick look at the issues list and make sure we haven't missed anything. I'm going to filter out. So, barring editorial issues, we have 44 issues open. Roy and Julian, just yell if you see one that you think we need to talk about. Now, a lot of these are relatively straightforward, or we have proposals for them that we just need to refine a little bit. So, do we want to talk about this one?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll open a couple of windows and then we'll.
I thought that was. I think. Well,
we have a proposal for that. Multiple setup with match.
All right. The question about is there a specific separator? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Let me get rid of some of these.
All right.
And I think the proposal was roughly this. And then we talked about whether this is, you know, a must or not.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this is exact separator used when combining header fields. It's issue 148. Ultimately, we talked about what we could change the RFC to make it more clear, or what we could change that would make it consistent for all applications. And I believe Mark proposed a requirement. Is it should or must?
Must not. No, sorry.
No.
may combine without changing the semantics of the message by appending each subsequent field value after stripping the surrounding AWS to the combined field value in order separated by comma SP.
Right, and we've never actually said anything about what's, should it be just a comma or a comma and a space or a comma and any amount of white space. We just didn't care in the past. I still don't care. So if anyone cares, this would be a good time to let us know.
I think the concern, as I understand it, well, Anna wants to have one way to do it so that he gets consistency between implementations. I think the concern is driven that in pathological cases, when you have header combination and space is semantically significant, for example, you're doing things like signatures, then it would be good to have one way to do this, especially if your signature algorithm is combine all instances of this header and then sign that, or you know, do integrity on that. You need one way to do it.
Yeah, presumably they'd be specified in the signature algorithm itself.
Sure. Does anyone else care about this?
My issue would be any additional requirement here would imply that everyone who doesn't do that is somehow broken, and I don't think that any implementations out there actually care in terms of, you know, whether they put the comma there at one space or a comma is no space or a comma in 5 spaces. The reason for that is frequently when you're combining header fields and they're right next to each other, you might want to just white space everything between the two so that you don't have to recopy it in memory. But that's a really implementation-specific concern.
Relaying for Chris Lemons. I care that we have precisely one way to do it. I don't care which way that is.
Okay. I mean, my impression is that the vast majority of implementations do comma space. But, you know, and maybe, I think it was discussed before, maybe one thing we could do is not put it as part of the requirement, I mean, it's a may, but it's still requirement language, but say the canonical way to do this is X, you know, and then divorce it from that requirement language a little bit.
Right, absolutely. If you can give people a hint rather than a requirement, that's fine too.
Okay, we'll figure that out then. Anything else? I marked this needs data because I think we left this in a previous meeting saying we wanted to get a little data about what's out there. But just to remind folks, we had this issue of, you know, header field names are defined as tokens, and that's actually an extremely permissive syntax. And so the suggestion was maybe we can cut it down a little bit. And I think folks latched onto that initially because they thought, okay, if we can constrain the syntax of field names, then that has potentially some security benefits. When you have strange characters in field names and then they're put into things like the environment or, you know, other places that can have surprising and sometimes dangerous effects. And then I think we got cold feet on that a little bit, in that folks felt that if we constrain the syntax in any significant way, we could be breaking deployed applications. And yeah, we talked about this in Bangkok, concerns about compatibility, reconsider on impact on a case by cases. And then, yeah, that's Willie said what HA proxy accepts. We discussed it twice in Bangkok? No, we haven't been there twice. Okay. And then in 104, still seeking data for characters used in the wild, looking at the HB archive. So I took an action, I think, to do that. Do we have any further thoughts about that? I just wanted to keep that on people's minds. If we do discover that, you know, in the wild, these meta characters are they're not delimiters, because delimiters are accepted from token, but the non-ASCII, non-letter, non-digit, and common, you know, delimiter tokens are used. Are we comfortable getting rid of those, or at least cautioning against them, perhaps? Any thoughts?
I for one, am happy to eliminate them just because we already have to do it in the back end for security reasons.
Right. And if we could get that pushed all the way up to the registry so that you can't register them, or you have to have an exception or whatever, that would be good too. Okay. I'll do that work then. I actually have to do that work for something else right now, so I can put two things together. No, that's fine. That's fine. I think we're done. Yeah, Ryan, Rose. So just stepping back, I think Roy and Julian and I are planning to get together around the quick interim in early February or late January and work on the drafts for a few days and try and churn out some of these issues, and especially the editorial stuff. We did a similar thing during HTTPBIS, and that was quite productive. So we're hoping that that'll get us to the point where this issues list is much, much smaller, and we'll have some drafts for review in the working group, and maybe around the Vancouver cycle we'll be starting to think about when do we do last call on these. That's my thinking. Roy, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd like to have all of the substantive text basically in there by the time we finish our meeting, and then we start rolling the process towards, working group review, and then last call, and then. Yeah.
I do suspect that we're, once we get all the stuff we know about now, we're going to step back and look at the documents and say, oh, we missed that, and oh, we need to think about that. So there might be a couple of more phases, but yeah.
The last thing I wanted to talk about was the issue about HTTPS and Quick, the authority. I can remember what the number is.
Oh, yes. What is that issue? Sorry, was there a Jabber comment?
Yeah, relaying for Roberto Poli. He wants to quickly discuss issue 99, scope of retry after.
Okay. Get to that one. And what was the one that you were?
With the comment, anybody have feedback on that thread?
Yeah, let's get that up real quick. I think my personal feedback, and I think I put it in there, is that, yeah, we can't really retroactively define a scope for the header in a meaningful way. That if you want to define one that's tightly scoped, it's probably best as a new header. It is defined as something that's vague, and so it's going to be used in a lot of different ways where it is used. And so narrowing it down is probably problematic, unless it's for a specific use case that says, use the retry after header to do X.
So Martin Thompson, I put a proposal for what might work as text in here, which is essentially, you just scrolled past it there. Which is essentially along the lines of what you said, recognizing the fact that you can't really retroactively go back and define something here. It basically says that when the server uses retry after, it applies to that request, but it may apply to other things. And the client may use other information to determine what other things that applies to, but otherwise it's kind of on its own, and sort of suggests that heuristics may be your best bet without the presence of that other information. For instance, if it's attached to a 503, often that is something that means that the server's overloaded or something along those lines, and you might want to treat that as applying to all requests that you might want to make to that server. But it doesn't explicitly say anything like that. It just says use your heuristics or whatever information you might get. I don't know if you want to consider incorporating that text or something along those lines. But
I think that's fine. I think we've known we've had this scoping problem not just for this, but for a lot of our protocol artifacts for a long time.
Yeah.
What I would like to do is probably put in the considerations for new headers and status codes and things. Think about scope very carefully and give some examples so that we don't dig further.
I think that might be a very good thing to have in general. Do you want another issue for that?
Sure.
Yeah.
You know my memory.
I'll open another one for you.
Okay, thanks.
I'll let the editors decide whether they want text along these lines. Though.
I think this text is fine. Roy, do you have any?
I mean,
yeah.
Feel free to reword it and butcher it as you feel appropriate.
Oh, we will. Okay, thanks. So the issue you were referring to, Roy,
Sorry. Roberto says, if you think it's worth writing a draft on that, I can try.
I don't think it's necessary. I think we can take this text. Up? Is it open still? I didn't think it was open still. I think we closed it. Yeah? Oh, you reopened it?
There are implications of establishing authority.
Oh.
You opened the new one.
Oh, did I? Oh, right.
Yeah, you might if you want a discussion, you go back to the 194 or from,
Okay.
yeah, probably 194, which is closed.
Yeah, I went and thought about this and then realized I needed to get state again. So it's probably good that we're talking about this.
Yeah. So what we're working on right now, literally, or what I was drafting on the flight over, and I read it last night, and it's not as good as I wanted, so I didn't submit it. Anyway, the notion of authority for HTTP and the notion of what is an origin server in HTTP is sort of enmeshed in the old way we think about the internet in terms of using TCP and HTTP. You contact an origin server on a certain port, and that defines the authority for HTTP. For HTTPS, you contact a TLS listening server on that specific port using TCP, and that defines the authority for HTTPS URLs. But the reality is there is a specific way of defining what the authority is, in the sense that we define the host of the origin server and the port and the scheme as defining the authority for HTTP. But then for TLS-based services, what occurs is a certificate handshake, which is applicable for the host regardless of what port it comes in, because the port is not a trusted interface. And of course, Martin can explain this much better than I can. Anyway, so what we're trying to do is rewrite the definition of what the HTTP authority is for HTTPS so that it is applicable to not only define which server you're talking to, but also allow things like alternative services and H3's use of Quick to take over that authority, or be able to represent itself as the authority, even though they're not talking TCP over the specific port. So it's basically redefining it as here's what authority means for HTTP, but here are these other ways in which that is also accomplished, not deprecating any of the existing ones. So that's the goal. Hopefully I'll get something finished tonight or tomorrow. And of course, we won't be ready for review until later in the quarter, but that's what I'm working on right now. And if you have anything that you want to be absolutely sure I include in that, feel free to add it to whatever issue this is. Which one is it?
237.
237. Yay.
Okay. I think we're at time, so thank you. Yeah. We have one more presentation. Oh, shit. Okay, good. Thank you, Roy. Thank you all. So Roberto, do you want to press the magic button?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Is the volume too high? I can try to lower the volume. So, thanks for listening. We are proposing this internet draft about standardized headers. The goal is to enable APIs to communicate service limits, so clients don't get dropped out, to align all already existing with limit headers and stop header proliferation. And the specification aims at expressing multiple rate limit policies. Next. On the left, you can see the actual landscape, and it's on the subset of existing headers. we instead are proposing just 3 headers that instead of using the number of requests, uses quota units. So it's quite flexible. And instead of stating the time units in the header names, just express it in delta seconds, so it's compatible with the retry after. Next. So this is the response header that you will get in your response. There is a mandatory part with the number of total units that you have got in a given time frame that we named window. The remaining requests, well, units that you have in your window, and how long, how time you have before the window expires. And then after this mandatory part, you can express optional parts with multiple quotas. For example, in this case, the first optional part states that you have 10 units every 5 seconds. The W stays for window. And then you are fully limited to 80 units per minute. This specification supports even comments in the optional part. The nice thing is that you can always ignore the optional parts and limit the parser to the mandatory part. That will change when we are going to consume all the second policy part. Instead of having 10, 6, and 3, you will get the information about the second policy. So the response, the mandatory part, will always contain the data from the policy that is going to expire first. Next. Our technical choices. The first one is to support only delta seconds, so you don't have to take care of NTP skew and adjustment issues, just like the retry after delta second syntax. Quota is expressed in units that may or may not be requests, so that you can support multiple quota policies, and you have comments. The semantic is quite flexible, so you can express dynamic policies, sliding window, and concurrency limits. We do not mention infrastructural concepts like connection, because connection with HTTP2 or quick or whatever are multiplexed. So we meant it to express just service information, just like HTTP. Next. We have open issues needing input. Well, the first one we have discussed above is related to the retry after stuff. So we want to, we need to define a throttling scope. We may want to define header dependencies. We might use structured headers to define the specification. We may want to use an upper bound for rate limit reset, which is delta second. And there have been some discussion about header names, but well, we can postpone them once we adopt the specification. Next. Thanks. I have to thank a lot of people for the initial contribution. There is Mark, there is Eric Wildy, there is many other guys, and thanks to Alex Martinez that is listening here and helped me significantly in the editing. And well, questions, I'm here for you.
Roberto, have Hello, Roberto. It's Roberto. So it seems like this and some of the things we were talking about for priorities share some similar problems. We're trying to express a priority to somebody who will hopefully take action to it. And caching becomes really interesting. The boundary by which we say where the implementation of HTTP or where that interaction actually stops or begins is interesting. Is the origin to the reverse proxy considered in this case? For instance, I think there are a lot of details that are similar here that we probably need to address in concept together.
Yes, I agree. Generally, we think that the headers are replied by the origin server, and the entity that knows the service limit and knows the service status for the backend service. And we filed many considerations on that, and it's interesting if you can contribute, and we are really open to this discussion. Our goal actually is to put everything on a common ground, because this kind of header can work only if they are the semantic is standardized, while currently we have a high proliferation of header, and this means that clients just ignore them because clients don't know which are the rate limit headers that they can find. I count in some environment there are 12, but client just can't iterate looking for 12 possible rate limit headers.
So one of my concerns here is that rate limiting can be twisted to be a form of denial of service attack, especially if it's combined with cache poisoning, and being underspecified about where this policy applies and who kills it or eats it or where it's not expressed becomes a very important security consideration. So I think that we can't afford to avoid this if we would spec it. Thank you.
I'm going to close the queue, and I'd ask the remaining folks to be brief.
Martin Thompson, I hope that you were paying attention to the discussion about scopes previously, yes. Roberto, not this Roberto, that one.
Yes.
Because I think that's highly applicable here. This is one of those cases where these things will apply across different scopes, and it may be that you need a scope parameter in this. I'm thinking about the case where you have a forward proxy that applies one rate limit, and then you have back-end servers that are responsible for parts of the space, and each of them have independent rate limits, and when you get a response back, you're going to get multiple rate limits back. And some of them will apply across the entire server, some of them will apply across, like, it's going to get a little complicated to work through all of those things, but I think it's workable with a little bit more expressiveness in all of this. I do share some of Roberto's concerns about the denial of service thing.
Relaying for Chris Lemons, it's going to be important to think about per hop considerations, because in some cases a proxy needs to communicate to a client that a given request is out of limit, and in some cases a proxy might wish to retry a request after the limit has expired transparently to the client. And then relaying for Thomas Peterson, is there a reason why this spec isn't making use of structured headers? This could apply to both the optional fields and replace 3 headers with 1.
Okay, thank you. So I had 2 quick questions, one for Roberto, one for the room. Roberto, there's as you mentioned, there are a lot of folks who are doing this in the wild, especially for things like HTTP-based APIs. Have you engaged with those communities? Have you had discussion with them about your proposal at all?
Yes, actually, we are doing this for the Italian API ecosystem, so we had to engage with service providers to get the implementation of those headers. There are a couple of cloud providers that are working on that. There is the co-editor that is from Treescale API gateway from Red Hat. And so we are working actually for getting consensus and get implementation.
Thank you. And the other question I had for the room is who has read this draft? Hands up. Okay, I'd say it's a smattering of the room. Roy?
Can it's Roy Fielding. I wanted to add that it's almost identical to what the GitHub API uses already, except the GitHub version of those same header fields is much simpler.
Okay. All right. I don't think we're ready to do a hum or anything quite yet, but this is something I think is definitely on our radar. Please continue to work on the draft. Please continue to engage with the working group, and we'll have more discussion, and we'll see where we sit next time. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Roberto. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So I think we're done for today. Thank you all very much. We'll see you all on Thursday. Thank you.